Today is Friday, November 1st. Gilbert is here with us. Welcome back, Gilbert.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
You are in Russia right now. Let's,
I'm in my apartment in St. Petersburg right now.
yeah,
So the lighting is not ideal. The sound is a little bit distorted when you're talking in a kitchen and you have a refrigerator compressor behind you, but this is the way it is.
yeah. Let's start with BRICS Summit in Russia. You believe that there are a lot of misinterpretation of what has happened in BRICS Summit. What's your take on what has happened?
First, the overriding observation is not, that I have is not very different from what my peers are saying. That is to say, I believe as well as they do that this is a world-changing event. But how it changes the world, in what time frame it changes the world, here we have differences. I take as my basis for interpretation not the declaration of the BRICS Summit, not papers, but words, words by the most influential person at the event, the host, Vladimir Putin, in particular in a couple of speeches that he made. One is on the second day, the so-called outreach day, when more than 30 heads of government and foreign ministers from various states, both BRICS members, BRICS designate partner countries, and just those who are onlookers. His speech there, and then still more importantly, his press conference at the conclusion of the summit were useful to see the dynamics, not a static statement of what our values are, but a dynamic statement of where the organization is headed and what are its priorities. And there I find myself in a slightly different position from what others are saying, other Russia followers are saying. And what I have to say, I think, is quite important to anyone who follows markets, because the number one issue is BRICS about de-dollarization, or is BRICS about something much bigger? And a lot of focus has been placed on de-dollarization as if this were the whole objective of BRICS. It isn't. The objective of BRICS is to create parallel structures for an emerging multipolar world. That is the objective of BRICS. And breaking the American domination of finance is a part of the process. But you do this with a sledgehammer, or do you do this with more subtle means that are not off-putting, that do not alienate prospective future members and partners of BRICS? And I would like to call out the real sophistication and the realism, as opposed to the wishfulness, of the organizers of this summit. And I direct my attention first and foremost to the Russians, to Mr. Putin, to the Chinese, Mr. Xi, and of course to Mr. Modi of India. They are the moving forces in what we saw last week. And above all, I think it's Mr. Putin, not just because of his intellectual leadership, but because of the team that he has managed that successfully organized a very delicate operation. These are all the guests are being told that they are equal and that the BRICS organization does not put one country above the other. And that these principles had to be realized, they had to be put into action when the heads of government were assembled. You can't have Mr. Xi having a 10-room suite and the president of Bolivia having a 2-room or studio. They have to be matched. And that is not an easy thing to do, particularly in a place like Kazan, which is, of course, an important center, an organizational center, but is not Moscow. I think it was very important for the whole purpose of BRICS and for the whole message of BRICS that it was held precisely not in Moscow, but in a provincial center, a very wealthy provincial center, because Kazan, as the capital of Tatarstan, is the main city in an oil-producing part of Russia. But nonetheless, it is not a normal center for receiving 30 heads of government and the like. So to have pulled this off, to have organized it in a way that left smiles on the faces of all the participants, as we saw from the television coverage, that was quite a feat. Now, what did they agree on? But as I said, they did not agree on dollarization as their prime objective. They agreed, it appears, to significantly raise the capital, the number of projects, the outreach of the new development bank, which is intended as an instrument to be built in parallel to the World Bank and the IMF. These are leading institutions of the American-dominated financial order in the world. And they are very cruel structures to emerging nations. To anyone who is in financial trouble, they come to your aid, but they virtually decapitate your country. They take control of your budget, and they impose this austerity, which of course is very cruel to the lower and middle classes of the country involved, and has political consequences. Well, the New Development Bank doesn't do that. It doesn't impose conditions of a political nature, and it is a very interesting point of attraction that BRICS has and will further grow in making itself a place, a safe harbor for emerging countries or for the global South. So that is one vector. Another obvious point, which has as the necessary consequence de-dollarization, is who has been invited in the last round of 2023, and who is as core members. I have in mind the United Arab Emirates and Iran. This is United Arab Emirates are a main repository of reserves from the oil-producing countries in the Middle East, and Iran, which is itself a major producer of oil and a lesser producer of gas. Now, in this round, in which no new core members are added, but 13 candidates have been named for partnership, we find two major producers of oil, and that is Nigeria and gas, Nigeria and Algeria. The point that I'm making is that at its center, the BRICS is growing its control over global supplies of hydrocarbons. And that all bears on the dollar, because the dollar's dominance and place as a reserve currency is bolstered by its position as the currency of exchange of the single biggest traded commodity in the world, which is oil. If BRICS has in it so many producers and such control, essentially, of the trade in hydrocarbons, it is working to de-dollarize the petroleum exchange. And that means that the petrodollar is in peril. And the petrodollar, as I said, is a major bolster, support for American financial dominance. Mr. Putin announced also at the BRICS Summit the planned creation of a bourse, of a commodity exchange, global commodity exchange for grain trading. The argument that was given is that this will take grain trading out of the hands of the speculators in Chicago and put it into safe hands of an exchange that seeks to reduce speculation and to assure the emerging countries of the world of food security. That is the humanitarian explanation for it. I can give you another explanation for it. It is another move against the dollar. Grain, wheat, corn, they are traded in dollars. If the BRICS has an exchange, you can be sure it will not be dollar-based. The same is true of the metal exchange. Putin announced that the BRICS is going to create a gold and silver exchange that will not be denominated in dollars. These are all kicking the supports out from under the dollar. So there you have it, a very subtle but powerful move on the dollar, but is at the sidelines of BRICS, not the central focus of BRICS. And why is there no effort to create a parallel to SWIFT, that is the global Brussels-based, American-dominated messaging system between all banks of the world, except those that have been sanctioned by the United States, like Russia and Iran. The world does its banking through SWIFT. It would be off-putting to prospective new members of BRICS if they had to forego the use of this existing functional system, if they had to self-isolate and turn themselves by their own efforts into sanctioned countries. So by their realism and maturity, the guiding hands of BRICS are saying to the world, look, this is a system, we are working to change global management, financial management, political management, but it doesn't happen in one day, and there will be a period of coexistence. And as two systems exist in tandem, the one that we know till now and the one that is being created under the aegis of BRICS, we do not require that you put all eggs in one basket, that you turn your back on the West and come running to us. No, you can keep one foot there. We don't mind that. It's just a matter of practicality that you do that. So aside from the technical, very serious technical issues over creating an alternative for SWIFT, there is the more important political consideration, not to pressure prospective new adherence to BRICS by imposing conditions that they can object to. So countries can have a foot in both camps. Turkey is an outstanding case, member of NATO. How could they possibly let it into BRICS? Well, into the core of BRICS, they're not letting it. But as a partner, yes, all right, partners will be allowed to sit on the fence, sort of have, as I said, a foot in both camps. That is a sign of real maturity and of self-confidence that they don't have to destroy the existing things to create a new system. They can tolerate a period of coexistence when they emerge and become more influential and more powerful than the G7 and all the other mechanisms. So these are I think what I saw as the main achievements and main directions for further development of BRICS, which none of us, and I put myself in that group as well, none of us foresaw. And that was quite remarkable.
What have we learned from what has happened between China and India in terms of their border problems?
Well, I understand that in preparation for BRICS, the two sides had an agreement that they would take measures to reduce the tensions and to find a practical solution to their border dispute. It was kept quiet. It was announced just as BRICS was about to assemble, and at the very start of BRICS, the body language of Modi and Xi made it clear that they have reached an accommodation and they intend to proceed as good working partners in BRICS, notwithstanding the past differences they have, and notwithstanding the fact that, let's face it, they are serious competitors for global manufacturing. The United States has been playing India off against China in that way as a way of reducing what the reliance of the global supply chains on China. Nonetheless, the leaders of these two countries, I say, are quite mature and realistic, and they're looking for accommodation and a way forward as leaders within BRICS. So that is all to the good. I don't say that BRICS made this happen, but BRICS helped this to occur.
And you mentioned Turkey. On the other hand, we had Saudi Arabia being part of BRICS, and nobody knows what's the situation with Saudi Arabia. Do they have any sort of solid understanding of what's going on with Saudi Arabia?
Certainly nothing in the public domain. The fact is that Saudi Arabia was at the summit 1 year ago. They were on the list of invitees. There should have been 10 members of BRICS, or more actually, because, but the Argentina dropped out, and Saudi Arabia held off giving an answer. Still, the relationship of Saudi Arabia with BRICS members is much closer than appears to the naked eye. After all, the OPEC Plus is managed jointly by Russia and Saudi Arabia. This is of key importance to the economic welfare of Saudi Arabia and of the Middle East, that they have this ongoing, long-lasting partnership, very close cooperation with Russia. So Saudi Arabia may not be in BRICS proper, but it's on the fringes of BRICS because of its very close working relationship with Russia, including the question, and I should say China as well, including the question of de-dollarization. The Saudis did not renew their obligations under written agreements with the United States over the petrodollar. The Saudi Arabians have been playing with selling to China in yuan. Therefore, in a general principle, Saudi Arabia is presenting itself as a major prospective contributor to de-dollarization. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is in a defense alliance with the United States, and it cannot just hop from one side to the other without taking very great risks. We saw when the Houthis forced Saudi Arabia to desist from its support to their opponents in the Yemeni civil war by bombing Saudi, let's say, by missile attacking Saudi oil installations. It was clear that Saudi Arabia is vulnerable militarily and has to be very careful. And part of that caution is not to completely alienate the United States. So I don't think that we have to be too concerned that Saudi has not signed up. They haven't said no. They haven't said yes. They're standing and watching for obvious reasons. I think that everyone is watching how the Ukraine war is evolving. And as I've said on other occasions, the mood of heads of state and heads of government is very much the same psychology that applies to ordinary mortals. They want to be on the side of winners and not on the side of losers. And for the last year, and particularly for the last several months, it has been perfectly clear to every objective observer that Russia is winning not just against Ukraine, but against the whole of NATO, plus another dozen or more countries that have signed up to provide support to Ukraine at the behest of the United States. But Russia is clearly winning. And so you had despite all of the efforts by Washington to sabotage the BRICS gathering and to remind the world that Vladimir Putin has been condemned by the International Criminal Court and all the rest of this propaganda. Nobody paid heed to it. They came, they enjoyed being the guests of Vladimir Putin. They took their selfies with him when they had an opportunity. And so it is a way of saying that the 30 or more countries that were there, representing like 45% of the world's population, do not believe anything coming out of Washington.
And the situation with Venezuela, that is the country is important for Russia in the South America. On the other hand, we've seen that it seems that Brazil, Lula, without the possibility of Venezuela being part of BRICS, what are they talking about in Russia about this? It was all about Brazil blocking Venezuela.
The Russians aren't talking about this. They know very well what you just said. But there are a lot of things they don't talk about. They don't want to endanger relations with Brazil. Brazil takes over the next year the presidency of BRICS. It would be very foolish to antagonize Lula over the issue of Venezuela. At the same time, I'd like to point out just the human side of this. I don't know what you saw. I was very impressed by Maduro. I don't know, he must have lost 20 kilograms. He looks very gentlemanly and very much a world leader. I think it's a question of time before he's admitted over, this will pass. The position of Lula will change over time. He has to show that he has some power, and he had every right to do that. It is the governing rule of BRICS that all decisions are made by consensus. Therefore, Russians would be bad sports if they denied the Brazilians the right to their own voice and to veto something. I don't think this should be blown out of proportion. On the other hand, it is notable that Bolivia was added. Bolivia is one of the 13 designated partners who will come on board in 2025. And the Russians gave some attention to Bolivia and to his president in advance of BRICS. And they pointed out to their audience that he is a real intellectual leader. He is a major actor on the world stage. Mr. Maduro he's embedded in Venezuela, okay. And he stands for certain politics which are liked or not liked by his neighbors. Bolivia is not in that situation. And Bolivia is led by a man who enjoys very big international respect. Therefore, for the sake of Latin America, I think it probably was better that Bolivia is the new flag carrier for their region in BRICS rather than Venezuela. Then, of course, you have a compensation. The compensation to the left, you have Cuba designated as a prospective partner. So, and then a few days later, as we know, just a couple of days ago, you had 187 countries in the United Nations General Assembly voting against American sanctions. You had on Cuba trade sanctions, the embargo, and you had only two countries, the United States and Israel, who voted for continuation of that embargo. So I wouldn't worry about which way the world is going. The American foreign policy of, as they used to say, me, that is pure, unadulterated egoism at the expense of the rest of the world, has been shown up. And remarkably, all of America's allies had enough of this. You would think that, all right, the EU would abstain. No. The great British poodle would abstain. No, they all voted against the United States on this issue. So the times are changing.
It's out of our discussion, but do you understand the behavior of United States toward Cuba, because they have been under these sanctions for more than, if I'm not mistaken, 68 years. It's unbelievable what they're doing to Cuba.
The United States is a very vengeful country. I'm not speaking about individuals. Individuals have very short memories, but the deep state has a long memory and is vindictive. You speak about the sanctions against the embargo on Cuba, the vitriolic language used to describe the Cuban leadership. What about Iran? The conflict with Iran didn't start last week. It didn't start 10 years ago. It goes back to 1979 and the hostage taking of the American embassy in Tehran, which is never forgotten by the American political class. So this vengefulness towards Cuba is not an isolated case.
Yeah. And talking about what's going on right now in Ukraine, do you think that Russia is shifting its focus from the Kursk region to other regions?
Well, I can't say that it's shifted its focus, but it shifted, well, it focused in the sense of what are they talking about? What is the news telling the Russian public? They're talking only about the front lines in Donetsk and Donbass, because they're scoring enormous victories. And the mood has changed entirely in Russian news coverage of the war. And they admit that, they say that themselves, that they have not seen anything like the present advances, not of inches, meters, but of kilometers every day. And we talk about the collapse of the Ukrainian army. No, it's not collapsing, and a different word is used both in Russia and in Ukraine. They speak about sipitsa. They say that the front is crumbling. Now, crumbling is not the same thing as running away, but it means that that there are weak points that are being revealed and taken advantage of every day along the front by the Russian troops. And they are proceeding with greater confidence, with more daring, I would say, because they are less fearful of a counterattack. But that being said, the Ukrainians still have very effective drone operations. And even on today's news, one of the Russian war correspondents was counting his blessings that he was not blown to bits with his car, because a Ukrainian drone did hit his car earlier in the day. So the notion that it's a steamroller and the Russians are just mowing down everything, it's not accurate. There is resistance. The Ukrainians, by pure perversity and I'd say cruelty of their senior command, are standing the ground, fighting and dying like men. That is praiseworthy, maybe if you write patriotic poetry, but for the sake of the Ukrainian nation, of course, it's a disaster that their men are being killed because they're ordered to stand and hold the ground, which is untenable, which cannot be defended, and they don't have sufficient fortifications to withstand the onslaught of the glider bombs and heavy artillery and so forth, and also the jet fighters that the Russians are throwing at them. For this reason, we see the front moving, evening out, and we hear words said that we haven't heard in 2 years, that they are moving not just on Pokrovsk, which is an immediate objective, but they're now planning their moves on Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Now, these are towns which had great iconic values, like speaking of the Alamo in Texas, because it's where the Russian Spring of 2014, the rising in Donbass against the coup d'etat government in Kiev, this is where their valiant local troops held out for 85 days against vastly superior Ukrainian army. Well, those towns in the middle of Donetsk Oblast are now in the sights of the Russian army. So a lot of attention is being given there, and this, of course, doesn't exist. Of course, there's fighting going on in Kursk. The mopping up operation somehow, I mean, it is a 150 or 160 kilometer long border, and there obviously are some porous parts of that border in which some additional troops from Ukraine are getting into Kursk and giving some relief to the remaining several thousand out of must have been close to 30,000 troops overall that were introduced by Ukraine into the Kursk Oblast. But these are still rather small units that are spread out over large territory and that is highly forested. And so it's difficult to flush them all out very quickly and at least cost in lives to yourself. So the Russians are doing a methodical, and they're doing this at their own leisure, one can say, while all of the dynamism in the Russian war effort is taking place in Donbass and primarily in Donetsk. What we have to remember is that going back to 2014, when the line of confrontation was frozen, these two main oblasts or regions of Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk, they were held substantially by Ukraine, not by Russia. This was true particularly of Donetsk. Lugansk, going back to the start of the special military operation, was mostly liberated by the Russian forces. Donetsk was not. And Donetsk, when you look at the map, the capital of the Donetsk Oblast, was just a dozen kilometers or so away from the line of confrontation. And therefore, for more than a year, maybe 18 months, the capital of Donetsk was subject to daily artillery strikes and short-range rocket attacks coming from the Ukrainian forces just over the border, so to speak. Well, these have been pushed back. The only strikes that hit Donetsk now are long-range missiles, not artillery, because they're out of artillery range. And the pushback that has been slow, very slow, by the Russians in Donetsk was made slow because of the 8-9 years of fortification building and digging in that the Ukrainians had done in the period between 2014 and the start of the special military operation in 2022. So it looks like nothing happened, nothing changed, but on the ground around Donetsk, a lot changed, particularly from a year ago, and now it's dramatic changes that we see in the last few weeks.
Do you think that, because we've learned recently that Ukraine is preparing to conscript 160,000 soldiers, new forces coming into the army of Ukraine. Do you think that they're getting some sort of information from the United States that in the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election, they're going to get some sort of aid to improve their army, maybe put Ukraine in a better position if at the end of the day they decide to go after negotiations?
Well, you can project big numbers of mobilization. Implementing that in the present situation of a very demoralized population, which is what's happened to Ukraine. When they're entering a winter period with 80% of their power generation knocked out, when they're going to face the home front will be facing freezing temperatures in their residences, lack of water, lack of everything that electricity provides, that will further demoralize not just the general population, but the fighting population. And I believe the presently observed deserters level and presently observed flight and hiding of potential draftees will be exacerbated. So it's inconceivable that numbers like this will actually find themselves in military uniforms. That being said, you come to the question of the disposition of forces. A large part of what the Russians are doing now is preparing for spring offensive. Their offensive, not a Ukrainian offensive. And they're doing that by occupying the heights. Now, there are no mountains in Ukraine, and the heights means 250 meters above sea level. But if you are 250 meters above sea level and the enemy is at sea level, then you have a very big military advantage. And that is what the Russians are doing. They're taking all of the desirable locations to support a crushing blow if this war continues into the spring.
How do you find right now in the mainstream media in the West, all over you find they're talking about North Korean soldiers being in Russia helping them against Ukrainian? How is that, in your opinion, what is the main reason of this type of rhetoric on the part of the West?
Well, there's several reasons, not just one. One of them is to cry foul and say the Russians are escalating, and therefore we are entitled to an escalatory path. So they're setting the public opinion to be prepared for the West to do something still more irresponsible in this war. That's one aspect of it. It's a diversion. It's being used to suggest that the Russians are weaker than they seem. It is to detract from the military success in Donetsk that their own newspapers and television reporters are putting out to the public every day. That the Russians are steamrolling Ukraine. Of course, as I say, that's an exaggerated statement, but that's how it's being described, even in Western media today. And if you say, oh, the Russians need to have those North Koreans to clear out Kursk, then it makes it seem as though the Russians really aren't so formidable as you thought a moment ago. So it's a demeaning disparagement of Russians and preparing the way for some kind of utterly stupid escalation from the side of the West. As, for example, actually setting off South Korean pilots in F-16s from Romania to defend Ukrainian airspace. That harebrained scheme is possibly what the dying days of the Biden administration might be plotting to enact. I don't think it will happen. I imagine that the South Koreans are not quite that stupid.
We are approaching the day that the United States would decide who's going to be the next president of the United States. So far, it seems both candidates have a good chance of winning 2024. But in the case of Donald Trump, if he wins, do you think that is he able to accept what Russia would put on the table to negotiate on? Because that would be so important that if he has the support from those people behind the scene to negotiate with Russia.
It will be a difficult situation for Trump. the Russians have already put their cards on the table, but they have absolutely no trust in him or in his judgment. And they do not accept the notion that he can knock heads together and bring them to the table, the Ukrainians and the Russians to the table, and end the war. I think that Trump, when he and his advisors look closely at the situation, will back away from this proposal of being honest brokers to end the war, because it will only involve them in approving actions that will be criticized by the opposition in the United States, by howls of anger over the American betrayal of this ally and future NATO member. So I think prudence will dictate that Trump solve the question in a manner that is least painful for his reputation. It takes the least political coinage from his side. And that's very simple. Stop sending money. Stop sending arms. That in itself will have the consequence of a Ukrainian capitulation, for which the United States can just wash its hands. Well, guys, you couldn't do it, too bad. But if he gets involved in negotiations, I think it will cost him a lot of political capital for no political gain.
How about the situation with China? Do you think that as we have these two conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, do you think that recently, I don't know if you saw the interview of J.D. Vance talking about Iran and Israel. He said, we are not interested in go to war with Iran because it doesn't matter how much Israelis are pushing for a war with Iran. It's not in our interest right now. We are not prepared for that. Because it seems that he wants to focus on China and what's going on with China. And at the end of the day, we see that the case of Ukraine and even in the Middle East somehow fading away, and the case of China is getting much more important in the eyes of the United States. Do you think, is that possible if Trump wins? We gonna have at the same time, I don't see that Trump would be able to put an end to any of these two conflicts in Ukraine, in the Middle East. But do you think, are we going to have a new conflict? Doesn't matter who wins, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And we're going to have a new front on Taiwan and a new conflict, which would, these two countries, Iran and Russia, would be part of this conflict again against the United States.
Look, Donald Trump is not a towering intellect, nor is he a man to make long-term commitments to anybody. He is a showman. He is a rather skilled political actor, and he knows the value of pre-election promises, which is nil. He is saying a lot of irresponsible things, which I think should power come into his hands, he will not hesitate for a moment to discard. Then there's the timing issue. The Ukraine war is with us right now. The Iran-Israeli conflict is with us right now. It is very good politics to say, oh, we have to go slow on these things because the bigger issue is the coming fight with China, which is not right now, which is, by American military estimates, 3-5 years away. I mean, in 5 years, Donald Trump will be out of power. Donald Trump today is not the Donald Trump of 2016, when he had virtually no control of who would be serving him. He was stymied by inability to get anyone through the Senate for approval. except those who were actually going to implement the opposite of what he wanted. And so he had people from Tillerson to Pompeo, not to mention his national security advisor, who are undermining entirely his intentions for foreign policy. That was the Donald Trump then. Donald Trump today has at his side formidable thinkers and actors. He has the world's richest man at his side, Elon Musk. Musk, I don't think for a second, could entertain the idea of a real conflict with China. Much of his fortune is invested in China. It's unthinkable that he would encourage Trump to head into a war with China. The other members around, other people around Trump, RFK Jr., as one, and the others, people with a lot of maturity and not an infantile wish to show who's boss to China. So I take with a grain of salt all of the pre-election discussion in the Trump camp about a coming showdown with China. Showdown in the future is one thing. A showdown in the present is something very different. And for that reason, I'm not at all worried about relations with China leading us to a world war.
You have to consider that Donald Trump is amazing when it comes to firing people as well.
Look, I have one enormous debt to Donald Trump, and so do all of my peers, only I admit it and they don't. If it weren't for Donald Trump, this show would not exist. And none of the other shows would exist, and we all would be silenced. He, by his impudent, irresponsible language, as viewed by the deep state, he has given us all a voice. Whatever else you can say about Trump, and there are many things, negatives, for me, that's a saving grace. And I hope it's also understood by all of your viewers. They wouldn't be listening to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gilbert, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Well,
and have a good trip.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.